In the beginning, God's original plan for people was to enjoy loving closeness with Him. We messed that up, choosing to make ourselves God. That's when sin entered. And sin, in the original Hebrew, is this idea of missing the mark, of shooting an arrow at a target and failing to hit it. The target is that closeness with God through obedience to Him. And a natural consequence of our sin is eternal separation from God. The rest of the Bible is about establishing these truths and pointing to Jesus as the Savior. Jesus, being fully human, was able to take all of our sin onto Himself on the cross, bearing the punishment we deserve. Being fully God, He was a perfect sacrifice for all of our sin, perfectly making amends for us. He rose from the dead, breaking the power of death, and it once again became possible to be close to God. The vast majority of other religions require works to achieve closeness with the divine. Jesus, on the other hand, paid the price we deserve to pay so that we can enjoy eternal closeness with Him in heaven. All we have to do to accept that gift is agreeing with Him that our sin is sin and accepting His sacrifice on our behalf. Then we can be assured of our place in heaven. Now the question arises, is all of this stuff actually true? Did Jesus truly die on the cross, or did He just faint and somehow recover later? Were the supposed appearances of Jesus just grief-induced hallucinations of His disciples? Were the Gospels, the supposed biographies of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, written close enough to the actual life of Jesus to be trustworthy? Aren't the Gospels full of contradictions? Did the early church silence key writings about Jesus? Were the Gospels reliably translated and copied over time, or are they just the product of legends spiraling out of control? Let's begin with Jesus' death. A flogging always preceded a Roman crucifixion. This entailed being whipped up to 39 times with a whip that had metal balls and sharp pieces of bone woven in, opening up the victim's back to the point where the spine was exposed. There are cases historically where victims died just from this. After the flogging, nails were driven through the wrists, crushing the median nerve, which is the largest nerve coming out from the hand. Up on the cross, the shoulders would become dislocated, and from there it was a slow process, death by asphyxiation. The victim would be naturally forced into an inhale position. In order to exhale, they would have to push themselves up, scraping their bloody back against the cross. This would be repeated again and again until exhaustion and death. What's important to note is that in the process of asphyxiation, fluid builds up around the victim's heart and lungs. If the victim's side was to be pierced, this fluid would flow out. This is exactly what the Gospel of John describes. One of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing on a sudden flow of blood and water. If a prisoner escaped somehow, the soldiers responsible would be put to death. In other words, the swoon theory, this idea that Jesus somehow passed out and recovered after the crucifixion, just isn't reasonable. What if the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus were legendary or were hallucinations? Granted, there are discrepancies between the gospel accounts of Jesus' resurrection, but there is a common thread. Jesus' body was laid in a tomb. The tomb was visited by a small group of women followers early on the Sunday after His crucifixion, only to find it empty and to see a vision of angels declaring that Jesus had risen. The discrepancies between accounts can be explained like a modern-day crime scene. Each witness will have slightly different details. Some accounts may emphasize certain details and omit others. If all accounts are exactly the same, the prosecutors have good reason to suspect collusion. As a historical example, the Carthaginian military general Hannibal crossed the Alps at one point in his career. Even though we have different accounts of the event with slightly different details, no one doubts Hannibal actually crossed the Alps. Furthermore, women in first century Palestinian society were extremely low on the social ladder. In fact, their testimony wasn't even legally admissible in court. If you were a writer from that time and set out to make up a story about Jesus' resurrection to convince your peers, it's very unlikely that you would include women as the first witnesses to the tomb, unless that actually happened. Additionally, the appearances cannot be explained away as hallucinations. Grief-induced hallucinations could be feasible if Jesus had appeared to one or maybe two people individually, but the Gospels record that Jesus appeared to multiple people in groups of different sizes over a span of several days. Historically, no one questioned the empty tomb. The question was about what happened to the body. A popular theory is that the disciples stole Jesus' body and made up the resurrection story. But it wouldn't make sense for Christians to steal Jesus' body and lie about him coming back to life, only to willingly undergo immense suffering for their beliefs. It's very unlikely, therefore, that Jesus' disciples stole his body and then concocted a myth about his resurrection. What if the Gospels were written so long after the life of Jesus that they cannot be trusted? A commonly accepted dating of the Gospels is that Mark was written in the 70s AD, Matthew and Luke in the 80s, and John in the 90s, placing them about 40, 50, and 60 years after Jesus' death, respectively. This is still within the lifetimes of many of the eyewitnesses of Jesus, including some of those in the religious councils with strong motives to correct any false information. In comparison, one of the earliest biographies of Alexander the Great, written by Plutarch, dates from over 400 years after his death, but is still considered to be generally reliable. What about all the contradictions between the Gospels? One example is the account of a centurion who asks Jesus to heal his sick servant. In Matthew, the centurion apparently asks Jesus himself, but in Luke, he sends elders on his behalf. While on the surface this may look like a contradiction, a modern analog to this situation would be a news report. A modern news report might say that the president said a statement, but in reality it was written by the president's speechwriter, edited by the press secretary, and the president may have reviewed and signed off on it. In other words, it's possible that when Matthew writes as if the centurion asked Jesus in person, he's representatively naming elders as the centurion. Many purported contradictions can be explained in similar ways, or by the fact that different witnesses will naturally have slightly different stories. What if the Bible we have today excludes important, unique perspectives on Jesus because they were silenced by an agenda-driven early church? Before the modern Bible was officially canonized beginning in the 2nd century AD, there was a high degree of unanimity on which books had authority, even across wide swaths of geography in a time when tools to collectively discuss and debate were still very primitive. The canon is a list of authoritative books, not an authoritative list of books. In other words, there's nothing about the process of canonization that gave the 66 books their inherent authority. The canon is simply a recognition of books with inherent trustworthiness, based on factors like proximity to the actual events. What if the Gospels weren't accurately translated over time? Archives today hold over 5,000 Greek manuscripts, dating to within a few generations of the original works. Compare this to other ancient texts taken as historical, where the earliest copies date from several centuries after the originals. Granted, there were errors made in the tedious process of copying texts by hand, but the vast majority of these errors are simple grammatical mistakes. No biblical doctrine is in jeopardy because of a scribal error. The most important evidence, though, is this: God is still alive and well, working in the lives of believers all over the world. The sense of peace and joy that comes from knowing that God personally loves me and has a plan for my life is a very real part of my daily experience. The question of whether Jesus rose from the dead has immense weight, and I'd encourage you to think about the possibility that Christianity isn't too far-fetched after all.